Well, thank you for staying with us. Thank you for joining us. We're back on the AM show with the big stories. It's a Monday morning, and we're going to be focusing on the economy. We're going to take it apart, different components of the economy, especially focusing on the DDEP, the renewed attempt. I'll be finding out from my guest whether it's a haircut, so to speak, or something else. I've heard that even our use of the word haircut may have its own dynamics. But this is where we are. We're going to be looking at the DDEP, the state of the economy, the IMF pact or agreement, and the way forward on that. Joining me in the studio is Dr. Theo Echampong. He's an economist and political risk analyst. Did I get that right?
Absolutely.
Great. Doc, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, great here. Morning, yes.
And it's, for some of you who are not aware of this, Doc usually is on the other end of town, so we'll have him on Zoom. So having him in the studio like this is a rare opportunity. He actually came down for the Banredu lectures, and we're tapping into that. Eventually, I'll also find out from him, some bits about the Banredu memorial lectures. And unfortunately, even as we contemplate Kojo Banredu, fantastic human being. I said it at the lecture that day. We've also lost Ochima Boaji, the former member of parliament for Bantama. Our condolences to his family and his party as well. But let's start with this. If I asked you today, Dr. Theo Echampong, what is the state of Ghana's economy? Just give me a snapshot. What would you say?
It's been tough. It's been difficult. I have interacted with a number of people you call ordinary Ghanaians on the streets, right? So this is from the pure water seller or the cocoa seller to the guy who sells PK. And their lived experiences, which is perhaps the biggest barometer of whether or not the economy is doing well, is one that is challenging for them. So we're seeing, of course, inflation still very, very high, in excess of 40%. And this impacts the people, cost of living, fuel, food, and things like that. And then, you've got the other macro variables that are played. If you're doing business and you want to borrow, you're still talking in excess of 30% borrowing rate. In fact, the Bank of Ghana's own policy rate is 30 or so percent. And we have made some progress on some of the debt restructuring, but even that, it still hasn't fully materialized as yet in terms of improving the fiscal balances of the country. So when you look at a number of the core economic indicators at the macro level, and you translate it also at the micro level on how it affects livelihoods, it's not a good story.
It's not a good story. Yesterday, this just reminds me of the National Youth Organizer of the MPP, Salam Mustafa. We had a conversation on the protest, the demonstration, 3-day demonstration, and maybe I'll pick your thoughts on that along the way. And he brought up inflation, citing the United States, for example, and I had to quickly ask him to refresh his memory about the percentage of inflation in the United States versus our inflation, which is the best we've seen in over 11 months, and that is still over 40%. Yes. That is the best we've had in close to a year, and it's still over. Can you imagine 40% inflation?
And in fact, it's probably, if I'm not mistaken, about the third highest inflation in Africa.
I mean, we were highest at a point.
So it's still very, very, very high. I mean, the point is, yes, we've had a global inflationary environment or story for the last 1 year or 1.5 years since Russia, invaded Ukraine. But different countries have felt it differently, right? So even when people make the argument that inflation is being felt in the UK, in the US, EU, and all these advanced economies, and it's at like a 40-year high in those jurisdictions, you're still talking in relative terms about 7, sometimes to maybe about 10% inflation in these jurisdictions. And even there, you've seen a major correction now where inflation is starting to come down as a result of the hikes in policy rate by the US Fed and others. But when you look at Ghana and you even look at Africa, right? In Africa, different countries, 54 countries. But fundamental question is, why is it that Ghana alone, you're talking in excess of 40% and you're comparing yourself to Zimbabwe and some of these other places that have had major issues with inflation over. So it tells you that fundamentally there's something wrong and amiss in the case of Ghana.
And you even look at that vis-a-vis food inflation. And now we're one of the highest when it comes to food inflation in Africa. So how much you earn versus how much you have to spend on food alone on the continent of Africa. I read a story recently from Business Insider Africa. And it is, we're in the top 5, you know, when it comes to food inflation. And that is also, I mean, because of course, then you have the issue to do with taxes. But definitely you are looking at fuel prices going up, food prices going up, the prices of other consumables going up. It means it's...
And in fact, it might even begin to go up again. Because remember that we're in September. Typically, around this time
I get to your point.
There should be food around, and then, you know, people moving food from the market, maize, yam, and all of that. So if inflation in as of the last reading was 40.1, I believe, or something around that mark, right? Going into the busy lean season in November, December, January, where again we've got lots of food imports coming in.
Exactly.
Then you're actually likely possibly to see inflation even begin to go up based on the historical trends and the numbers. The other thing is, inflation is also driven, of course, you need to look at the household consumption expenditure patterns. And in Ghana, relative to other African countries, we're spending typically about half of the household consumer expenditure is on food and fuel, right? Other people spend a little bit more, but we sit in the middle or the median pack. So if you're earning, for argument's sake, 2,000 cedis a month, and you're spending 1,000 cedis of that on just food and fuel or transportation, and you have these global shocks, but also local factors at play where your exchange rate, okay, it's relatively stable, but you still have the food component going up, then you end up spending more of your money, right, just catering to these basics before we even start thinking about, you know, having to save and put some of the money away for a rainy day.
And those are very interesting dynamics you bring to the point. I just want us to look at taxes before we get to the DDEP and how we've gone about it, timelines and everything. There's this interesting picture. Recently, I mean, you know, now they're taxing betting.
Yes.
So your wins, I think, when you're trying to, they take 10%.
Yes.
Okay. Now we've heard, I don't know whether it will materialize, of some celebrity tax where, you know, if you go and MC a program, you'll be hit. I mean, there's withholding tax. I mean, there are some gigs that you get of a certain magnitude. And yes, we've been doing that. But you want to generalize this? So you go for that birthday party. Hey, you go for... I don't know whether that will not bring about tax evasion. Because tax avoidance here in this jurisdiction is okay. But tax evasion is the problem. But you look at all of these things. Of course, for an administration that said they would move our economy from taxation to production.
Yes.
You are in the UK. You pay hefty taxes.
Yes.
But you get, what are the boons, the benefits you get from the state versus what we get here? Terrible roads and galamsey and everything, you know, in between. Do our taxes in Ghana make sense? Do our taxes make sense? We are paying about a third or a fourth. If you go and eat at any eatery or something, you're paying about a third or a fourth of that, I think, in taxes.
So it's a chicken and egg thing, right? The point is that we need to raise the tax base. That is undisputed. So if you're collecting 13%, 14% of your GDP in terms of taxes, and your peers are doing 18, 20%, even in Africa, in the sub-region, then you have a problem, right? So then the issue then is, what are the tax handles that traditionally we have been collecting these taxes from? And if you actually, break that down a little bit, you begin to see that for a major chunk, we're doing all these indirect taxes, right? So people are paying maybe something on fuel,
you purchase
VAT,
credits,
you go and buy
credits.
things and all of that. And that is, roughly, if you look at the numbers here, consumption taxes other than VAT is about 30% of our tax structure, right? In Africa, the average is about 24%. And if you look at individual taxes,
So ours is on the higher
it's
side.
on the higher side, even in Africa. In the OECD or more advanced countries, it's about 12%.
Which is lower.
Which is much lower. So you need to flip that. So flipping that means that in Ghana, individuals are paying it's just 14% in individual taxes, pay as you earn, PAYE, and all those things. South Africa is doing 34. The African average is 15. OECD average is 24%, right? So you need to shift that structure from some of these consumption taxes more to direct PAYE type taxes, right? The argument can be made, which is, okay, what do we use the money from, which I'll come to in a moment because you're talking about roads and all of that. But the fundamental point is that there are some tax handles that we need to restructure, including things like property taxes. And I also support the betting tax, if not for anything at all, in trying to shift certain consumption patterns or trying to change certain behavioral, patterns. You were talking about, people doing celebrity endorsements and all of that. Now, if you went for a corporate event, of course, they would take withholding tax.
Exactly.
But if
7.5% will definitely
if you went to officiate maybe a colleague's wedding, you're an MC, and you're paid, for argument's sake, again, let's say 10,000 cedis, right? I think it's fair that a certain portion of that needs to, because other than that, then you have to do your self-declaration, self-filing, and all of that. We don't have all of the processes at the moment.
Those processes are practically hobbled. But even the incentive to do it, even if the processes were there, it isn't there.
Okay. So you now shift the burden to the person paying you. If they're doing maybe a Momo transaction and all of that, of course, they take the 1% e-levy. That's done and dusted. But the fundamental point is that it's a service that somebody has rendered or you have rendered to the person. And if it's a service, then there must be some minimum type of, right?
I mean, what you would find in many other jurisdictions.
In other places,
that is the case.
You pay.
But we've been lazy with our tax system.
Yes.
We've overburdened a small group.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to the direct taxes.
Yes.
And gradually, we've created a system where that small group has become tired of being taxed. You're being taxed out of pocket because everything you get, you're being hit with some taxes. And like I've said, you look around you look at your roads. Look, if you're sick in this, you don't want to fall sick. I take very good care of my health, my supplements. I try to work out. I try to, as much as possible, though I slept about only 3 hours between yesterday and today. But you try. Why? You don't want to fall sick in this country.
I agree with you. So
the systems are not there. Health is not there. You are being poisoned through galamsey. Roads are bad.
Yep.
Flooding it's all over the place.
It's, some they say be chaka, right? Some in the local language.
You remind me of Idris Abdul Karim's song from, was it 1990 something, or was it the early 2000s? Nigeria jaga jaga, everything scatter.
Things are tough, right? In the UK and other places where some of us are based. Okay, if you get sick today and I call an ambulance, I know within about 5-10 minutes an ambulance is going to come, take you to the hospital, take care of you, and all that. So we have a legitimate right and concern to voice out our opinions about how the monies are being used. We cannot run away from the fact that there's a lot of wastefulness, there's a lot of inefficient spending, partly also driven by corruption and the political economy and the political cycle. That's driving all of these. Those are the structural issues that we need to address. So, like I said, chicken and egg. yes, we need to raise taxes or reform some of the tax handles, but we also have to see the government being much more open and honest about its spending, number one, and then also efficiency in the spending. We've done quite a lot of work, myself and others, over the last 4 years. And if you look at many sectors of the economy, especially some like the social sector, so health, education, and there's a lot of waste in the system. And you can quantify the extent or the amount of this waste. And if you are able to block some of them, the procurement-related issues, the non-implementation of GIFMIS, things to do with varying expenditures or incurring expenditure overruns, then there may not even be a need, right, to introduce these new tax sort of handles. So we need to do both. It's not like a binary choice where you either...
It's either this or that.
That I don't subscribe to that.
Okay.
You've got to do both.
Quick one, just to wrap very quickly, 20 seconds on this. Taxation to production, is it possible in our system? How do we go about it?
You need to reform.
Because obviously this administration said it, but they are not living up to it. How do we do it?
Yeah, no, so the how comes down to, let's look at the individual tax handles. And then also let's fundamentally ask ourselves, what is the overall economic agenda or strategy that a government wants to pursue, right? And that has to even be linked to your national development agenda and plan and all of that. Because it is those strategies that gives course or gives way to the tax instruments and the handles that you use to drive growth. The challenge we've got currently is that there is some growth, but it is not translating into improving livelihoods. And number two, it is also not translating to even improving productivity. You get a point? Because you need to see the growth influencing or improving productivity, and ultimately what that means that you have a much bigger basket even when it comes to taxes. So not until you have a very clear structure of what you want to do in terms of economic reforms, in terms of even your public service, public financial management, then the issue of even taxation becomes a bit moot. And that's been part of the challenge that this government has
since 2017, when this, so let's say 2017,
yes,
when this administration took over, January the 7th, have you seen any progress in those respects, those areas?
If you look at a number of the core economic indicators, so 2017-18, you see an improvement, even in some of like the factor productivity things that I'm talking about. But then just after 2019, going into 2021, and you can even add 22, a number of these indicators actually have gone the other way. And remember, we even warned about this. I've sat in this studio and others and say, look,
this was long before COVID.
Were heading into
this was long before COVID.
Before COVID, during COVID, and even after. Just before we round up. So, because remember, during the COVID time, the government came and said that they were going to spend almost about initially it was 4.5% extra of GDP in deficit spending. And then the target was revised to 7.8%. This is all in the budget, right? By the end of the pandemic, coming into even 21, 22, we had ballooned that in excess of 12, 13%, deficit spending. And not all of that went into addressing COVID. Some of them were driven by the elections-related spending. Okay.
Now let's talk about, I just wanted you to bring to bear some solutions. Let's talk about the DDEP. If you look at what the IMF told us, we were expecting, do this once. Let it be as painless as possible. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but don't overdo this. Ensure that different aspects of the economy can still stay above water, keep afloat and all of that. Those were the descriptions from the IMF. Then you look at what we did in the first one, even having to have a tussle with pensioner bondholders, picketing and all of that. And then we are told, okay, get ready, round 2 is coming, and you might be brought back in. And the pensioner bondholders are like, whoa, wait a minute, what are you talking about? ESLA bonds, Dachi bonds in the fray. And then we hear, if you read the memorandum, they even talk about the fact that T-bills may, that is from the initial document, may, at some point fall into these. Now we know there's an over-dependence on T-bills now from government's end because the capital market, international capital market, has been closed to government.
Yes.
What is your reading? What does all of this mean as we go for round two?
So for starters, let me maybe be very emphatic. Any attempt to restructure T-bills is going to spell disaster, right? Because the government is had to borrow at the short end of the market. This is what mostly these T-bills offer, 182-day, maybe about
short
1 year note to meet some of the short-term liquidity needs. And if you look at the current state of the financial sector and all the issues therein, if you try to push to, restructure Treasury bills the way they've done with the other bonds and other instruments, it will cause a lot of fear, it will cause a lot of panic, and the very liquidity that the government is even looking for may actually end up drying up. If you look at the rates now, right? The Bank of Ghana put out some statistics just a few days ago, the quarterly summary of economic statistics. If you look at that data point and you look at, let me quickly jump in here, you look at the Treasury bill rates currently in excess of 30-something, percent. But even the old bonds that were restructured just a few months ago, right? These were listed on the secondary market. For example, the 2-year note in August of 2022 was 26.64%. Then the restructuring happened. And then in March of 2023, these were replaced with new instruments. So 4-year bond up to 15-year bond. But the rate there on average is about 9%, right? So you're moving from 26 to about 9%. As we speak currently, this August, and these are statistics that the Bank of Ghana has published, you're talking almost 19%, right? So you've done the restructuring, brought the rates down, listed it, and the markets basically don't believe you.
Yeah.
Right? So you see
but with everything that has happened, market confidence would definitely not be there.
The people still demanding a higher premium to be able to hold these government instruments. And so if you now want to even now extend that to Treasury bills, which is almost like a no-go area, I mean, it's just going to be quite calamitous in my view.
And we even hear that, and this is information that we can confirm, that even at the inception of all of this, some people were allowed to convert their bonds into T-bills. And we ask ourselves, who are these faceless people? We know that those in power, a lot of these members of parliament, ministers, hold bonds. So if we are in this together and then some section can, find an escape route and then you say, I don't know. So partly, I don't know all of the story around that, but I think, yes, in the early days, potentially some groups of people may have been allowed to convert, their bonds into short-dated instruments. But the issue is this. After doing the domestic debt exchange, the core reason that we were told, right, was that you need to safeguard the economy and you need to improve things so that the economy doesn't, in a way end up collapsing. But if you look at some of the other safeguards that the government itself said that they will be doing, right? So there's a bunch of documents from the Ministry of Finance. This document is the investor presentation document that they made in December of 2022. It's a slide, but on slide 6 of that document, they talk about a series of measures that they were going to implement to mitigate the negative impact on the economy. Right.
3 of them are listed. One of them, they say regulatory measures to mitigate the impact on the banks participating in the debt exchange. So some of the forbearances and all of that. What has happened on that front? they talked about setting up a financial sector stability fund, $1 billion USD or something like that. What has happened to that? We're almost getting to the end of the year.
Yeah.
The banks will be reporting similar numbers, and it's not
the losses will continue.
Right. They talk about social measures to protect the poor and the vulnerable. We've seen some attempts on that side, but when you're talking or dealing with 40-50% inflation, whatever you throw in the bucket will still not be enough to offset the losses that people are making. But the reason why the second round of the debt exchange, again, the government is going around it or trying to push for it is, remember that the government has to restructure the external debt, right? And in the IMF document, it showed that we had a financing gap of about $15 billion. Some external or from official creditor sources, IMF, World Bank, and then others, what you have to get from your Eurobonds and the restructuring. And for 2023, we needed to have raised $2.4 billion of financing or debt relief from these various creditors. As we speak currently, those negotiations are still ongoing. They've been fraught and it's been challenging. And the point is that by the end of the year, you may still not have had that 2-point-something billion coming through. So when you have that gap, then you begin to see why government would then want to push other forms of restructuring on the
So in other
side.
words, this, if I could put it in a different way, this pain, second dose of pain that we're going to have to take, or second bitter pill, is because government...
We've taken bit of it. They've done the cocoa bills.
True.
We've done some of the local dollar-denominated bonds. And then the proposal is to even restructure pension funds and all of that. And we've seen Dr. Edouanani and the likes going to say no to that. And then there's this T-bills thing that is in, which for me, I think it's just going to
be... It's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer.
Can we put this down to recklessness from those who manage the financial space? And here's why. Even as we talk about, I'm broke. Imagine someone who is deadbeat. I can't even feed my family. So give me maybe some 1,000 cedis and let me put my house in order. He gets the 1,000 cedis and then, he starts living a lavish lifestyle, getting some very nice clothes and all of that, and fails to do the very thing that he said he would do. It smacks of something similar. Within a period of 2 months, our public debt has ballooned by 6.3 billion Ghana cedis. So like Professor Bokpin says, you say you are broke, yet your spending is not slowing down. It's actually shooting up.
It's going up, and the numbers are there. You can look at the debt numbers. The recent one that was released in the Bank of Ghana statistics. Again, you can see even the total public debt as in dollar terms, we're still talking about 52.3 billion. As a share of GDP, is around 71.9 or roughly 72%. But the rate of borrowing and debt accumulation, you look at the numbers in nominal terms, is still going up, right? And we're saying you want to cut back on expenditure, you want to, do lifestyle.
It's like a wishy-washy thing. We will, but we never do.
We never do. And the issue also goes back to the extent to which the fiscal side, right, the borrowing side tends to dominate even the monetary policy side, right? To the point that we've been here, Bank of Ghana has had to spend over 60 or so billion, right, just to support the government last year. Now ask yourself, if the Bank of Ghana is declaring profits of maybe 4 to 3 billion every year, and in 1 year you've incurred almost $60 billion loss. It's going to take you almost about 30 years to recover those losses on the basis of the profit historically
But is that really the reality? I've had some people say that is not the realistic picture. That it will not take that much time to recover from.
It could even be 10. It could even be 10 years. It could even be 5 years. But the point is that we've had the fiscal side, the Treasury, Ministry of Finance, practically dominating the economic policy making agenda of the country. And not until you sort of address that fundamentally, you're still going to have issues with the inability to control and to bring down things like inflation and all of that.
So of course, the Bank of Ghana, the central bank, is the regulator. Now, how will you even regulate? What are you regulating? So we have a flux.
Yes.
We have a fiscal imbalance,
there is,
so to speak.
On the monetary side, there are some reforms that have to be done at the Bank of Ghana. So the limits on, for example, when, how, where you borrow, all those things, some tightening of the Bank of Ghana Act. But we have even advocated, so myself and others, to even go a bit further when it comes to financial and macro prudential regulation, that perhaps it's time to actually decouple the regulation of the financial sector away from the central bank. So you need to have a separate entity, you know, like in the UK, they've got the financial.
I was just about to ask, what pertains in the UK?
That does that, and then get the central bank to focus solely on, you know, the issues of monetary policy and things like that. I think we're getting there, but this crisis offers us an opportunity to perhaps, you know, fast track that process as well. But quickly before we end, the issue of the fiscal dominance, you can trace it back also to the election year or the elections.
2020?
It's all from, you can go back from 2008, 2012,
2016.
And in the lecture, I showed a slide that shows you very clearly, if you look at the difference year on year between our revenues and our expenditure, in election years, you see a big jump, right, on the expenditure side. And then you see sometimes even a drop on revenue, or sometimes the revenue goes up marginally. But the jump in expenditure year on year, especially in election years, is sometimes 4 or 5 times more than the difference in revenue that you're making.
It appeared to have been slightly controlled in 2016, if I remember correctly.
A little bit.
But there's always still that spike.
You still see the spike.
The surge is there.
It would be great maybe if they could put the chart up on the screen for
I saw it when you put it up.
Yes,
at
but
the
consistently you see that. So 2016 comes down, it's still there. But in 2020 during the pandemic, you see a huge, you know, almost 10 percentage point increment in the year-on-year change in expenditure. So the election, the political economy, the spending issues are at the cost of the things that we're talking about. And also the point that even all this talk about borrowings and all of that, when you do the analysis, and again you track our GDP growth year on year versus our public borrowings and expenditure, the two are moving in different directions. So there's no direct correlation between your GDP growth and even your public expenditure patterns. And that's worrying.
That's a great worry.
Because it shows you that you're borrowing to service debt and you're not borrowing to improve the productive capacity.
You're just borrowing to satisfy debt obligations, but the real, and that's why you keep talking about. So on the macro level, you see some growth, some level of growth, but it's not trickling down. The micro level is practically non-existent. Then inflation comes in, whittles everything away. You're paying debts. In other words, the ordinary person on the street will just be moving from bad to worse. There's nothing you can see down there.
And we are not saying that the macro is not important. What I and other economists have perhaps come to a realization is we've become, for the last maybe 10, 15 years, too fixated on the macro side, right? And less about the micro, the structural transformation, improving productivity, and linking these to things like outcomes, so that it is not enough for a politician to come and tell me that I have built 10K VIPs or I've done this school or that. How is that improving or translating into your education outcomes or health outcomes, right? Or, connectivity times. Those are the things that I think we need to push our political class a little bit more on as we get into an election year.
Let's quickly look at the IMF program. coupled with the general state of our economy. I mean, now Fitch, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, etc., have become household terms. Everybody knows them now on the back of where we find ourselves. But in terms of our economic health, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you say we are? And then we can get into the IMF program and how well we are faring.
So relative to where we were in January, there's been some improvement. Hence why we actually even have an IMF program in the first place.
So what would have been your score in January? What will be your score now?
In January would have been probably 4. Now I would say maybe about 5.5, 6.
Okay.
Right? And I also think that the IMF actually is in town this week. They're going they're going to be having a series of review meetings which will feed into the second review of the fund program. And in early November, we should expect a release from them as to whether we get a second tranche. And again, I am very confident and optimistic that we actually will get the second tranche. We're going to get a $600 million.
Why?
A number of the structural benchmarks and the indicators that we need to have met before the time. So if you just indulge me a moment,
sure.
Just to pick on one or two of them. So, for example, by the end of June, we should have had a stock take of all payables by the ministry, department, and agencies. We should have had a strategy to strengthen and rebuild the financial sector buffers, an energy sector recovery plan, how you're going to streamline statutory funds, and then also have a medium-term revenue strategy, which is approved by Cabinet by the end of September. Some of these things, I know some works have been done and are ongoing, and some have been completed, some are still works in the process. But if you look at these structural benchmarks and some of even the indicative targets, so for example, bringing inflation down, the international reserves of the country, seeing an improvement in that, and you look at the latest Bank of Ghana numbers, the reserves numbers have begun to inch or pick up a little more. It gives me some confidence or assurance that we would pass the second review and we'll get the $600 million coming in. The challenge, I think, really becomes what happens next year as you go into the election, where historically we've had issues in there that we need to address. But as far as the second review is concerned, we would pass that and we'll get the $600 million coming in.
What would that do to our economy, do you think, getting the second tranche? Because, of course, we know that when it comes to our basket and what we even use the funds generated by the state for, very few items, consumables, basically, paying public sector workers, paying off debts and all of that, consume practically everything. 2 or 3 items consume practically everything.
Yes.
What impact would those $600 million have? Especially as we are talking about, yes, you get money, yes, there's growth in some sectors, but how does that trickle down?
Yeah. So immediately it's just the liquidity support. So that's the first thing. The money hits Bank of Ghana's accounts, and then it helps bolster the reserves that they have and have a couple more dollars in the system. And again, remember that if this is coming in November and we're going to get into the busy December period with all the flurry of activities and all of that, just having some extra reserves in there to support your currency helps. Then that money will be moved from the reserves, or bits of it, to support general government budget programs for the latter part of the year. I mean, $600 million in relative terms is still actually not that much if you look at the quantum of the deficit and the financing that we have. So there might still be a need to actually do some scaling back or cutting back on the expenditure side of things. That's why I think that the 2024 budget, which will be read in November, is actually going to be very, very, very critical, because a lot of markets and players are watching what happens when the budget is read. The good thing is that the IMF would make their announcement before the budget is read. In the IMF's timetable, it's going to be early November. budget most likely may be read middle or third week in November. So that would send a positive signal to the market, but people will still be jittery. People will still be wanting to see, okay, what have you done fundamentally in terms of the reforms that you've committed to since the beginning of the year? That's what a lot of market watchers are watching for. And then number two, whether or not this second round of this debt exchange, particularly Treasury bills, may even go ahead. And I don't think it will happen because it's just going to be quite disastrous in my view.
Then we let's even look beyond the current economic turmoil we're going through. Just a sneak peek into the near future. We're going through all we're going through. Bonds have been rescheduled, recalibrated. The economic confidence in the economy is at its lowest. Okay? But then you look at whatever administration will take over from here. Recently, I found it interesting when Mr. President was talking about, people asked him questions about this and that. He says, whoever takes over from me. And that created quite an interesting picture, almost as though this tenure had been written off. So I had a sidada. Let's get to the next one. But the next one,
yes,
we're already in such a deep hole that some people say things are not going to change even with, another administration could come in and some things would, but it wouldn't be anything substantial because the hole is so deep that even getting to the surface, to talk of starting to build from the surface, you start a building, you lay the foundation. But this one, you are so deep down, even before the surface.
Yes.
What is your reading of that? And what is the reality? What can we expect in the coming, let's say, 5 years, 5 years?
The numbers are clear. You can go to the IMF's own report that they issued a few months ago. You can look at some of the government presentations that they have made a few months and weeks ago. It is very clear. It will take us at least 3 to 4 years to even have some semblance of stability. That's just what the numbers are telling.
That's the most basic.
Right. And historically, think of it again. If you have a new government come in 2025, right, they will still be under an IMF program. And this program is going to run until 2026, barring any extensions that may be given, right? And if you're talking inflation in excess of 40%, for argument's sake, and it's been sticky for a while, it's not coming down as fast as you want, even when there's a lot of food, bumper food season, then it tells you that the road to recovery is not going to be as straightforward as we want. Number two, the road to recovery won't be straightforward because you're looking for $15 billion to close the loophole that you have. Of that $15 billion, you're hoping to get $10.5 billion, right? 70% or 7 cedis out of every 10 cedis from restructuring your external debt. And that process has become a bit challenging and sticky. And we've seen in the case of Zambia how it took some time to get resolved. So fundamentally, until that external debt restructuring and whatever we'll get from them is resolved, there's still going to be, some lingering effect of feeling as to people expecting what would come next when it comes to the economy. So with turning things around, it will take a while. It will take 3-4 years. And this is also borne by the historical data. You look at all our IMF programs that we've been to, especially in the recent times. You do the analysis. We go into it 3 or so years, things start to improve. Another election comes, and then we're down in the hole again.
Just to wrap the conversation, this is my final bit to you. 2 things. You recently delivered you were the main speaker at the Banredu Memorial Lecture. Any thoughts to share from there? And then finally, do you have any thoughts on the Occupy Jolobi House demonstration and everything that happened there? Just quick thoughts.
Let's start with the demonstration. People have a right to demonstrate. It's a constitutional right? We've seen the challenges with the economy. We've seen cost of living issues. why are the people there in the first place? They talk about the economy, they talk about mismanagement, they talk about corruption, and the poor state of the roads. I was listening to your radio this morning, and they played a tape of this Stoneboy complaining about the motorway, and he had an accident and had to replace his knee and things like that. These are real issues, and to the extent that they affect people and that they have, negatively impacting their livelihood, they have a right to be there to protest. There were issues with police hounding, chasing people, but I think on the second and the third day, it seemed to have been a bit more
though they were not allowed to get to the Jubilee
and all of that. So as for the right to protest, it has to be done. And there has been no change, as far as I'm aware, in the history of the world and development where people have not had to fight, right, to get certain rights and privileges accorded to them. So for me, they're right to be there, and if they so want to protest, then so be it. I think they've even saying they're going to be staging a series of protests in December and all of that. I mean,
hopefully we'll not see these scenes of
arrest and all of that.
But
just to wrap up in terms of the lecture.
Pardon me, there's something that escaped me. You could also rope in the Bank of Ghana building, the cost, the headquarters. That has also come into the fray. I mean, it escaped me, so you can just add it to
it's coming into the debate. I'm not a
Does it make sense? I mean, $250 million.
I said, I think a few weeks ago on a news file that, of course, on hindsight, with COVID and everything, it may have made sense to pause the building. Others have also argued that, with these projects, when you stop and you come back again, sometimes you end up spending more money and all of that. I don't know the details around that. But the point, I think, is that if your central bank is spending 55, 60 billion, extra and all of that, perhaps it causes us to pause and reflect on what other line items and even spending patterns at the central bank, itself on that front. And then on the sort of Bar Radio lecture and the take-home points, I spoke about public finances and investment and some of the points that we're talking about here. But the key point really is the challenges that have bedeviled this economy is not only down to Russia, Ukraine, and COVID. The signs were there. The fundamental weaknesses in terms of lack of diversification is all been there. Number two,
it's an interesting bit. How much of all of this, because Russia and Ukraine and then COVID have been flogged so much? So technically, if you could attribute, let's say the kitty is 10 in terms of the factors that led us here, how much of it would you attribute to COVID-19?
I haven't done the sort of detailed breakdown, but you can also look at the numbers, aggregate numbers, right? So you look at public expenditure patterns, pre-pandemic, and then pre-Russia, Ukraine, and then do the analysis. And you can see very clear, it's in one of the charts that I showed you. During the COVID period and Russia, Ukraine, you see a huge bulge. The gap is like this big between your revenue and your expenditure. The government came, like I said, and told us that they were only going to spend 5% or so extra, even revised the figure down up to 7.8 or so percent. But at the end of the year, when the numbers came, we're talking in excess of 13%. So that clearly, for me, cannot all be down to the pandemic effect. In fact, that year, remember, we were going into an election as well. So some of those election spendings, and I'm being very emphatic about it, some of those election spendings were masked under the ambit or umbrella of COVID-related spending, and the numbers bear this, out as well.
Final words.
Final words, and related to this is that when it comes to the way we run our public finances, especially on the fiscal policy side, the electoral cycle effect is very, very dominant. And the analysis that I have done, others have done, shows that even over the medium term, up to 2026, 27, you will still have a constrained fiscal space. So we need to able to go back to the roots, amend some of the laws, impose restrictions, and try to deal with this yearly electoral, related spending. number 2 and 3, and I'll wrap up, is that any for the economy to be sustained going forward, external debt restructuring is going to be important. And if we are not able to do that and it keeps delaying, there will be pressure to continue with this domestic debt restructuring and all of that. And also, these debt restructurings have distributional consequences. They impact livelihoods, and some of the interventions that the government has announced or wanting to do to mitigate that, we need to get some clarity as to what is being done on that. The 2 last points I would raise, and from the lecture, is that when it comes to budget and financing, like I had indicated, we need to move from just focusing on inputs. I've done this road, to actually asking, how has that improved or translated into bringing down poverty, inequality, and all of that? There are opportunities to digitalize.
It's akin to what we do here. Oh, so we've done the AM show and all of that. It's not about the show. What did you achieve in the end? Is the result.
Yes, it's the outcomes.
Simple.
Right? And the output. And then on public procurement and the corruption issues that we've been talking and what's led people on the street,
right?
The auditing functions, the institutions, internal, external audits, value for money, and all of that. All these things will ensure that at the end of the day, you have a credible budget.
Right.
And, both Ghanaians and investors would believe that this is a government that is worth investing in. Other than that, we'll still be in for trouble.
Doc, we're grateful that you've joined us this morning. So refreshing, and we're very grateful, even privileged to have you in the studio. He doesn't always come to town. We dragged him to town for various reasons, so we are grateful that you've come here physically today to share your insights. And keep it up with all of these that you're doing. We wish you the very best as you in all your endeavors. Dr. Theo Champong is an economist, political risk marketer as well. Did I get that right this time?
Analyst. Political
risk analyst. I keep confusing you with another political risk analyst. I got it right the first time.
Prof. Kobe Mensah.
Yes. Okay, so that has been the conversation on the DDEP, the general state of the economy, among others. But coming up, Democracy Hub had a 3-day demonstration. Day 1 was not so good. People were apprehended, 49 of them. But days 2 and 3 were massive, elephantine, if you like, if I may play with words. But at the end of all of it, what was achieved? What are the lessons that have been learned? And now they say they're embarking on a series of demonstrations to keep the pressure on. But what is the plan? We'll be having a discussion with the group up next on the AM Show. Do stay.